Good afternoon and welcome to What's in it for Africa. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Would you speak about energy?
Definitely.
What about economics?
Yes, for sure.
What about climate change?
Definitely.
Yes, but what's in it for Africa?
Well, you'll find out.
Hello and welcome to What's in it for Africa, the EU Africa update show with me, Uzo Madu. On the show this month, Brexit for Africa, also the EU's draft budget for 2017, and the Transatlantic Investment and Trade Partnership Agreement is discussed in the European Parliament, specifically its implications for developing countries. And a political agreement is found on the conflict minerals legislation. And of course, Turilla Abiyede from the European Centre for Development Policy Management will be with us to tell us the EU Africa updates for July. So let's get started. On the 23rd of June, the UK public voted to leave the European Union, and since then, media headlines and financial markets have been dominated by the news. Now, the UK is facing a political upheaval because the EU is keen for the UK to invoke Article 50 to start the exit process, which sets a 2-year time limit for the exit to be complete. Not only that, the UK government is now facing a leadership contest as David Cameron, the current Prime Minister, will step down before October. And what's in it for Africa? Well, the markets reacted quite badly to the Brexit news, which was expected since the markets do not like uncertainty. And some of the largest African countries, like South Africa and Nigeria, already struggling with economic slowdowns, have now added uncertainty to their economic outlook. Now, trade is possibly the biggest issue on the Brexit for Africa agenda, and it's clear that by leaving the EU, the UK will now be able to independently negotiate new trade deals. However, there are a few key concerns and considerations that also need to be taken into account. Africa might not be at the top of that trade deal wish list, specifically because the UK only accounts for around 4% of all sub-Saharan African exports. Another consideration is that under existing economic partnership agreements between the EU and African regional blocs mean that actually the UK cannot get more trade preferences than are given to the EU under economic partnership agreements. On the flip side, under a new trade agreement between the UK and African countries, there might also be an opportunity to better negotiate trade terms that are more flexible and are more in the African interest. Also, there's the argument that actually carrying out trade agreements with African Commonwealth countries is also another route for the UK to strengthen ties with African countries. However, this would add another regional framework on top of the multiple and overlapping ones that already exist on the continent, one which may divide Anglophone Africa with the rest of the continent. This is an important consideration at a time when two major intra-African trade deals are set to become a working reality by 2017. The main issue at the moment is that everything is still very unclear until official negotiations start between the UK and the EU. However, we will be following all the developments on Brexit for Africa, so make sure to keep up to date on our Twitter and Facebook page. The European Commission presented the EU draft budget for 2017 to the European Parliament last month. Now, the budget proposal is set at just under 158 billion euros, which relates to promises for future payments and is just shy of a 2 billion euro increase compared to last year. Now, the EU budget is made up of member state contributions, but also customs duties on imports coming from outside of the EU, as well as things like sugar levies and value-added tax. The budget line includes 58.9 billion euros towards sustainable growth and natural resources. This includes money towards the Common Agricultural Policy, which maintains commodity price levels within the EU by subsidising production or imposing quotas. Now, this budget line also provides support for the EU's common fisheries policies, under which the EU has agreements with several African countries totalling around 125 million euros. Essentially, it secures exclusive fishing rights for the EU in these African water territories. The Africa Progress Panel actually found that investing in the fishing industry could bring 8 times more money to Western Africa, for example, than selling these fishing rights. 4.3 billion euros is set to be allocated to security and citizenship, with 2.2 billion proposed for actions outside the European Union. Now, this includes things like reinforcing external borders, dealing with the refugee crisis and irregular migration. Now, to put this amount of money into perspective, 1.8 billion euros last year was put forward by the EU to set up the African Trust for Migration. And 9.4 billion euros has been proposed for Global Europe. It's the EU's external actions, things like its common and foreign security policy, but also development aid and humanitarian assistance. Now, we know that the EU is the biggest donor to Africa, and actually the sub-Saharan African region receives on average around 30 to 35% of EU's official development assistance. The draft budget will now be considered jointly by the European Parliament and EU member states in the Council for approval by December. The TTIP agreement, which is under negotiation between the EU and the US, was the focus of a debate in the European Parliament last month, specifically how this agreement might affect developing countries. During the debate, the EU Commissioner for Trade, Cecilia Malmström, stated that TTIP would actually not have a negative impact for developing countries, and it would actually be beneficial. The reason that she gave for this is that because if the US and EU economies grow, then the rest of the world would benefit. But also because the more the US and EU export, the more suppliers in developing countries benefit also. However, there are possible causes for concern for Africa, most notably the easing of trade barriers between the EU and the US, which could make it more difficult for African goods to access this transatlantic market. However, there is the argument which was raised in the debate that the tariffs between the two countries, the EU and the US, are considerably low already, and therefore the impact might be negligible. Another possible cause for concern is that TTIP might devalue trade preferences given to African countries under trade agreements with the EU or the US, because EU and US exports will become more competitive compared to those from third countries. However, the EU and US trade in very different goods than with their African partners, so it will largely depend on the products or the types of products that will be subject to lower trade barriers. So we will need to wait for more details in order to properly assess this issue. So TTIP is still a long way from finalisation, and there's no clear deadline in sight. So the precise elements of the agreement are still not clear. However, there is a more general consideration about this agreement, which is the fact that it goes beyond trade and also goes beyond the most advanced rules and regulations that affect and impact international business. Another general consideration is the fact that the EU and the US actually make up 50% of the world's economy. So it's sure to have global implications and could set the tone for global trade for years to come. So it will be important to keep a close eye on the development of these negotiations for the following months. The EU reached a political agreement on the conflict minerals legislation last month. Now, the agreement means that European importers of tin, tungsten, tantalum and gold will now be required to complete mandatory audits on all of these minerals coming from conflict or high-risk areas such as the African Great Lakes region. Now, this is with the aim of cutting off financing for human rights abuses. The original piece of legislation actually only required voluntary audits to take place. Also, companies that have products containing these very minerals will be encouraged to also report on their sourcing practices. Now, unlike rules on conflict minerals in the US, the new EU rules apply to all conflict-affected and high-risk areas all around the world, so there is no geographical limitation. Now, the technical details still need to be worked out over the summer period, but after this, the application date of the new rules will become a lot clearer. Now let's turn to Tarilla to find out what's on the EU-Africa agenda in July.
Hi, I'm here to tell you what's in the pipeline for EU-Africa relations in July. Slovakia assumes the rotating presidency of the EU on 1 July to the end of December. There is some concern amongst EU member states about how the Slovaks will deal with migration issues, considering their strong position against allowing migrants into their country, and their Prime Minister's view that it is impossible to integrate Muslims. The European Commission will put forward its proposals on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals ahead of the UN meeting on 11 to 20 July. This is where countries will gather for the first time to agree how to take early actions on the SDGs. The EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs will put forward an EU strategy on economic diplomacy. It will focus precisely on how EU foreign policy can support the European economy, essentially how the EU can promote its own economic interests globally. Economic diplomacy can be understood and deployed in many ways, from the use of sanctions to discourage hostile behavior to investments in poorer countries to create jobs. The recent European Commission communication on migration and support to African countries to manage it includes references to a future integrated EU-Africa strategy. There may be discussions in July on precisely what this entails. The EU-East Africa Community Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA, will be signed during the UNCTAD conference on 17 to 22 July in Nairobi. The deal includes free market access for EAC to the EU market and 82% market liberalization for the EAC side. The agreement covers goods only, not services. It also includes a trade and sustainable development chapter, which includes commitments to trade-related development cooperation and sustainability clauses to strengthen regional integration in the EAC. Following the recent signing of the EPA with Southern Africa, this leaves only West Africa left to sign the EPA. The European Parliament will adopt a resolution on the future of EU's relations with the African, Caribbean and Pacific Group in July. The current agreement expires in 2020, and the Development Committee would like to see that the framework for future ACP-EU relations take into account existing regional and sub-regional organizations. The committee would also like to see that the framework will be legally binding. While the Foreign Affairs Committee has called for the EU-ACP relationship to be built on a fair partnership post-2020, which must support the Sustainable Development Goals, but also highlights the importance of the emergence of a dynamic private sector that will foster sustainable economic development. Make sure to give your opinion on the future of ACP-EU relations in the public consultations before the 21 August on the European Commission's website. The third meeting of the Social and Economic Interest Group from Europe and Africa will take place in Nairobi, Kenya on 6 to 7 July 2016. The main topics this year will be migration and climate change and agriculture. The objective is to raise awareness of the financing needs for farmers and other social and economic actors to adapt to climate change and improve knowledge and understanding of available sources of financing. The European Commission will publish a report on the EU Development and Cooperation Results Framework, which measures the EU contribution towards global development goals and the development outcomes and outputs supported by Europe Aid and EEAS over the next years. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to watch What's in It for Africa every month to stay up to date.
Thank you for watching the EU Africa Update show this month, and remember to subscribe to our mailing list. Follow the link in the video description box below or visit the website for more information. Also, only 2 more weeks until the next dose of EU Africa Current Affairs with the Inside the Issue show. Now, this is the last EU Africa Update show until after the summer, so have a great one. But remember, if you're signed up to the mailing list, you will still get lots of EU Africa updates throughout the summer period. And remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, and also follow us on Twitter. And you can find us also on Quick TV Africa and Afroland TV. My name is Uzo Madu for What's in It for Africa.